Hi, folks. It's Andy, the Analytical Preacher. I want to try to use this podcast to clear up a misconception that I've heard a number of times from different folks in different places, and it's the belief that science has proven that there's not a need for God. Not just the God of the Bible, but there's not a need for a God of any type. Now, of course, it's impossible to prove that something doesn't exist. I'm almost certain that Bigfoot is a myth, but I can't prove that Bigfoot doesn't. Someone could prove Bigfoot does exist by providing me with a Bigfoot carcass, but it's hard for me to prove that Bigfoot doesn't exist. So science says we can't prove that God doesn't exist, but if science has provided an explanation for everything that we see and everything that we observe, there are no holes, there are no gaps in our knowledge, then at least we can confidently, definitively say that there's no need for a God. What would a God do if everything is explained mathematically by science? And so the question comes occasionally, has science in fact done away with the need, at least, for any type of God or any type of godlike attributes existing in any entity? The answer to that is not only no. The answer to that is closer to the opposite. Let me explain. You don't really have to be a scientist or be that big a fan of science. I'm going to throw a couple of things out here, but everybody will be able to follow along to our final conclusion. We're going to start with what's called the second law of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is just the science of energy use, energy transfer, heat transfer, that sort of stuff. And the second law of thermodynamics, and it's also known, you may have heard it in a science class in high school or college, as the law of increasing entropy. So the second law of thermodynamics, or the law of increasing entropy, simply states this: that as energy is used, as energy is altered, as energy is consumed, some of it is wasted, heat expires, and the system which contains it then becomes less structured. It becomes less and less organized as the energy is used or altered. In other words, the entropy of the system goes up. The chaos, the disorganization of the system that contains the energy goes up. You don't care about that other than to say this. One of the implications of the second law of thermodynamics, of the law of increasing entropy, is that the universe cannot be eternal. The reason it can't be eternal is because the system would be completely disorganized and the universe would lack all usable energy at this point. We know that's absolutely not the fact, so the universe cannot be eternal. Now, of course, we get to, on the school ground, what we call the chicken and the egg dilemma, and what in the halls of academic science they call the fallacy of infinite regress, which basically says this: if there is something material that exists, me, you, this microphone into which I'm speaking, then something eternal must exist. Because you can't keep going back. Well, where did this egg come from? Well, it was laid by that chicken. Well, where did that chicken come from? Well, it came from that egg there. Well, where did that egg came from? Well, it came from the chicken there. Okay, at some point, there's something that had to start this process. It simply can't be that we infinitely regress back, saying this came from that, but that from that, but that from that. At some point, there just has to be something that just is. There has to be something that's just eternal. At one point, a number of scientists and philosophers thought, or at least they hoped, that the universe was in fact eternal. Then we don't need God, quote unquote, to explain its existence. We now know scientifically that the universe is not eternal, but if there is something eternal, then what is it? As we try to answer that question, it gets a little more interesting when we consider some of the implications of the first law of thermodynamics. And the first law of thermodynamics is really straightforward. It simply states that in our system, in our universe, energy cannot be created and energy cannot be destroyed. So the amount of energy in the universe is what it is, and it's always been static. It may go from more structured and more usable to less structured and unusable, but the amount is the same. Now, we have to understand, of course, energy can be transformed. It can be altered. So matter, mass, can become energy and vice versa. We think about Einstein's famous equation, which is probably the most famous equation in all of science history, the E equals mc squared formula. The E there is energy, of course, and the m, of course, is mass. And Einstein is just simply showing how mass and energy can be converted one to another. And so when we say the first law of thermodynamics says energy cannot be created or destroyed, it also is saying mass, stuff, cannot be created nor destroyed. So if our universe is not eternal, and within our universe, matter and energy cannot be either created nor destroyed, then the necessary conclusion is something outside of our universe had to be responsible for the creation of our universe. We can take it a little bit farther, of course, and say there must be something eternal. There must be something eternal that's outside our universe. Scientists will tell us that this eternal thing needs to be infinite. So there's an eternal, infinite entity that's responsible for violating the laws of our universe in order to create our universe and the laws which govern it. So something that's eternal and infinite is responsible for supernaturally placing our universe and the laws that govern our universe into place. But apparently, this supernatural, eternal entity exists in a dimension different from our universe and from which we cannot detect in our universe. Science calls this entity the multiverse. And if you watch much of the Science Channel on TV or things like that, you will have no doubt run into the multiverse. If you've taken certain science classes in high school or college, you may have run into the multiverse. The multiverse is this eternal, infinite entity that exists in another dimension, which can violate the scientific laws that govern our universe, at least momentarily, at least long enough to put our universe into place. Because again, within our universe, the laws would say the universe cannot be created, it cannot create itself. And another law says, and it's not eternal. And so science just takes all of these implications and all of these necessary conclusions and says, this is what must be out there somewhere. That is a fine conclusion on its own because it is essentially, the logic of it is airtight. That is exactly what must exist out there in order to explain what is sitting here speaking into this microphone. Scientists, in order to give this an aura of scientific rigor, put all sorts of mathematical equations out there that talk about different dimensions and all sorts of different differential equations that talk about the change that must have occurred and so forth. But frankly, they're just really trying to put some glamour around the idea that there's an eternal, infinite entity out there that can violate the laws, supernaturally create our universe, but not be detected from our universe. There's a theoretical physicist from Germany who has a popular YouTube channel, Sabine Hossenfelder. And Dr. Hossenfelder says these theories that are explaining the origin of the universe, these multiverse theories, they're just modern creation myths written in the language of mathematics. She says they're not real science, they're pseudoscience. The real science is to say that eternal entity exists, and it must logically exist given what we know about our universe. Once we try to turn that into a scientific theory and put mathematical equations on it, she says now that's no different than some creation myth that the Aztecs or the Mayans or some other culture has created over time. They just make it look fancier by putting some differential equations associated with it. I'm sure at this point you all understand where this podcast is going. I agree that there must be scientifically, that there must be an infinite, eternal entity out there which supernaturally created our universe and established the laws that govern our universe. I believe that that eternal, infinite entity is the God of the Bible. Science doesn't say it has to be the God of the Bible or it can't be the God of the Bible. Science has simply proven to us something with the attributes of the God of the Bible must exist in order for us to know that what exists in our universe exists. As to why you would choose to believe that that eternal entity is the God of the Bible as opposed to an impersonal multiverse in a different dimension or any other possible option that would fit those attributes, I would recommend you to my podcast called How Do We Know That the Bible is True? God has actually provided a way to validate that the Bible is true and that therefore the God of the Bible that wrote that Bible is also real and true. And so I, again, recommend you How Do We Know That the Bible is True podcast here on the Analytical Preacher channel. And just to make sure no one is misunderstanding what I'm saying here, I am in no way saying that science and religion, that science and Christianity are opposed to each other. I have another podcast. It's called The Relationship Between the Bible and Science. And in that podcast, I explain that actually the Bible requires scientific efforts by humans and that the scientific findings that humans continue to uncover continue to confirm that the scriptures are correct. There's nothing that science has determined that counters the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible that said that science has ever proven untrue. It goes much further than that. I explain in that podcast the relationship between the Bible and science, why the Bible actually compels us, requires us as humans to undertake scientific efforts. So why I'm not in any way saying in this podcast that Christianity's right and science is wrong. I'm not saying that at all. Science has proven to us many things about how the universe we live in works. God told us that our universe will work in a consistent fashion. Now go figure it out and subdue the earth and have dominion over it as you come to understand how I mechanistically built this universe. And as we study science, it improves our lives, but it also gives us a beautiful picture of the majesty and complexity of the God that we worship. So in no way are science and Christianity in opposition to one another. I just wanted to clear up because I hear this belief, this misconception so often. Some state it as a concern. I'm just concerned that science has proven we just don't need a God anymore. That's not true. Science needs an eternal, infinite entity that at least momentarily could supernaturally violate the rules that govern our universe to put our universe in place, to make matter and energy static in our universe. And that eternal, infinite entity exists in a dimension that is outside our universe and is therefore not detectable by our universe. If it's an impersonal multiverse, we would logically know it must exist, but could go no further. If it is the God of the Bible and God has provided us with scripture that allows us to validate that that scripture is true and that therefore the God that wrote it must also exist, as I claim in my How Do We Know the Bible is True podcast, then it's not an impersonal multiverse, but it's the personal relational God of the Bible. And we should all have a faith and a belief and a relationship with that infinite God of the Bible. But in closing, has science proven there's no need for the God of the Bible or any other God? The answer is no. In fact, the answer is the opposite. Science has progressed to the stage where some entity with the attributes of the biblical God are in fact absolutely required to explain what we see scientifically in our universe today. Thanks for listening. Until next time, this is Andy.